This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today, Denise Shull. She's a decision coach and performance architect, leveraging her training in psychological science to solve the challenges of mental mistakes, confidence crises, and slumps, ranging from Olympic athletes to Wall Street traders. Her most recent book, Market Mind Games, considered one of the best of its genre. But what's so cool about Denise today? She's the real-life consultant, the inspiration for one of the most fun Wall Street shows ever seen on TV. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Denise Shull. Denise, we're going to dig into your background today, dig into your specialty. But right now, you've become quite well known for something that's damn interesting. So this Showtime show, Billions, something that I've not seen the second season, so please don't tell me anything. I have to wait to get it on iTunes or something like that. But I really enjoyed the first season, and there's a lot to unpack there. But why don't you explain how you became involved with the show? Because I believe you were offering some insights and helping to put together one of the core characters.
In the summer of 2015, I got an email from Andrew Ross Sorkin saying, hey, I'm involved in this drama, and there's an actress who plays a hedge fund performance coach. She'd love to meet you. And I was like, really? Because I hadn't heard anything about it. So, of course, I looked it up, and I was like, oh, this is going to be interesting. Connected with Maggie, and then she connected me with Brian Koppelman and David Levian. We met, and I explained all kinds of war stories and how I work. At the time, they had talked to Tony Robbins, is my understanding, and I'm definitely a bit different than Tony Robbins in the way I work. And then I continued in contact with Maggie, referred her. She wanted some help. Believe it or not, she went as far as neuroscience. And I gave her some books to read that I thought were practical in terms of neuroscience.
She's playing the character Wendy Rhodes.
Yeah. Maggie Siff. I was impressed with, the depth at which she wanted to go, frankly.
Okay, so here's the operative question. How much of Denise shows up on screen?
I feel like a fair amount.
Really? Explain. Give me some details. This is so much fun. Give me the grist.
Well, so, for example, episode 11, I think it was last year, Magical Thinking. I was watching it with some people and not knowing, and, they turned to me and they're like, oh, my gosh, that's like you. And this is the one where she and Axe are working late in the evening after he's had the bad trade, and they end up talking about his feeling guilty, other emotions from other situations that were influencing his trading decision. And then I got an email from a former client in Australia that I hadn't talked to in 3 or 4 years saying, I just watched this and that was so Shull.
Well, what's cool about that is I would think many people that dedicate their lives to professions become quite proficient. Perhaps they get asked to consult, and then the finished product goes off in a direction where perhaps that original consultant is like, oh my gosh, why did I ever talk to them? But you seem pretty positive about it.
Yeah. I think in her professional work, this won't be giving away anything, but there's an episode this year where she says, what feelings do you have? Or what are you feeling? I would say, what feelings do you have? But she says, what are you feeling about that? I think, to be exact. That's how I work. It's kind of fun, really.
Let's start to unpack this some, because I really enjoyed the show, and I enjoyed it from having grown up in the DC area. The political side, the government side rang really, really true as well.
Right.
From my trading side, though, I don't have any experience with the X character. I have experience, and we can talk about this and perhaps delineate some today, but I have experience with folks more in the automated side of things, not the high frequency shops, but more of the long-term trend following shops where generally over the last 20 or 30 years, they've become pretty damn systematic. And even a guy like Ray Dalio will say he is generally at the systematic place. But the X character, well, that begs the question also to someone like you. And of course, you have, with your background and your clients, you can only tell us so much. And I won't attempt to pry any more than I can. But I of course, when I see the X character, I know that you consulted. I can only imagine that you have consulted with and trained the types of traders that we would see in billions. Is that fair?
It's fair to say that I have consulted with a wide variety of traders and portfolio managers. And when I say wide variety, I'm referring to their personalities and their quirks, but that also covers their, styles and their amount of money under management. I feel like I have been, privileged to realize some common characteristics. Yeah. At the end of the day, everyone's human.
While we're still in the beginning here, talking a little billions, have you seen anything up close and personal that resembles the Axe character in some way or another?
What qualifies as up close and personal? I mean,
look, I know I can only get you in so many. So when I try to get some of these things, I know I can only push too hard. But you know what look, I think people watch that. And look, from my world, if I kind of look at it from a kind of a trend following automated perspective, if you were to walk into the office of that particular type of trader, you're not going to see the screen time, the typical Wall Street floor, the more kind of instinctive or perhaps the need for that screen time all during the day because their situations are thought through in advance. They're price-based traders, and they don't need that. But on the flip side, when I look through your work, clearly there's a difference here. I'd love for you to kind of delineate for the audience how you yourself, when you're walking into the room and you're dealing with such different styles, how do you start the process of assisting? Because as you just said, we're all humans. So it doesn't make a difference what your style is. There might be different advice or performance help that you can give, but it's we're still human.
The way I work is, and it doesn't matter, who I'm sitting across from or who I'm on the phone with, is I am trying to understand the sequence of feelings the person is experiencing in the decisions they're making and what are the patterns of the sequences of feelings. At first, I'm just trying to get that for myself as step one to help them be able to realize all of their feelings and all of the sequences of feelings. Because, we've all been taught to be analytical, and we've all been educated to be analytical. It's what we believe, and I mean analytical in a mathematical, probabilistic, logical, and if you could see me right now, you'd see I'm doing quotes with my fingers, way. While what we know about the brain is being completely upended, like World Economic Forum is writing about, like, maybe all the brain research is wrong, and a woman that I'm close to and a big fan of her work is writing the same thing. So it may be that everything we think about our thinking is just wrong, but I've known that everything we think about our thinking is wrong from the perspective of how much feeling and emotion is actually in our perception, judgment, and decision making. I'm always looking for that dimension, feelings and emotions, that the person usually doesn't know they have, doesn't know is repetitive, certainly doesn't know where it comes from or what it means. Then by helping the person be able to look at their feelings as data, they start to be able to see, wait a minute, I had these other dimensions influencing my perception and judgment. So, back to Wendy in episode 11, that's what she was doing with Axe after he made, I can't remember the details of it, but there was a seriously bad trade where they lost a seriously lot of money. She was basically helping him understand that it had to do with guilt and some other feelings. Helping people get accurate, actually, about what's going into their perception and judgment, really it starts to remove roadblocks that they didn't maybe knew they had, but certainly didn't understand.
Let me follow up there with the axe example. I don't remember the exact episode either, but let's just go with where you just went. He basically let the loss get too big.
Right.
I hear what you're saying. Could one say, well, hold on, that was just bad technique, not having the loss mitigation stop process set in place for... Could someone push back and say, well, hold on, one can always have the feelings, and we're all human, but is that just bad technique on his end?
Well, see, that's what everyone says. The conventional wisdom is exactly that. It's bad technique, and you solve it through, improving your processes, improving your rules, following them. What happens, though, is that never completely solves them. People make the same kind of mistakes over and over. This I can tell you. Everyone that I've worked with, and this is part of being human, but I mean, it's also part of portfolio management training. Everyone has an Achilles heel. They have that market situation where they make the same mistake. And most people attempt to put process and techniques in place. Now, granted, my clients are, sort of self-selecting in a way. Maybe there's somebody out there that I haven't met, but basically what happens is people say, and I did it again. And that's when I get them, like, why did I do this again? Well, why you did it again is this dimension of feeling and emotion that you think you're supposed to set aside. You're trying to set aside when in fact you need to make overt, conscious, analyze it as a motivator so that you can both understand a feeling or emotion that's driving you to make that same mistake that appears as an Achilles heel, but also so you can start to be more aware of intuitive feelings that are really unconscious pattern recognition. Technique is the standard answer, but I can tell you this for sure. It doesn't usually solve the problem. I mean, it may mitigate the problem, but inevitably people will make the same kind of mistake again.
What's the aha moment that people have with you when you were able to get them to think about that feeling and I guess thinking of it as a piece of data, getting them over that hump of to where they're no longer, it's not holding them captive?
Honestly, I was going to say Wendy and Billions didn't quite go here, but honestly, it goes something like this. I am rationalizing getting bigger in this position because it seems like, if I liked it at 20, I love it at 15 kind of thing. And we had this long-term analysis. But really, they realize it's about proving that they're smarter than the next guy. And it's about, or something else, but proving they're smarter is a common one. Proving they're smart enough to, frankly, many men to their father, since you ask. But what I'm really saying there is the aha moment is I realize I've had this situation in the markets multiple times. I realize that I have this set of feelings that drive that. And oh my gosh, I realize that set of feelings is the same set of feelings I had when I was ninth grader and I got cut from the football team. And frankly, fill in the blank 4-letter word. I'm doing this and it almost has nothing to do with this market decision. It has to do with these feelings related to my self-image and who I am and proving who I am that I can remember from growing up. And then people are like, oh my gosh. And then, well, that ought to be easy to solve because I start to see how that's not related to this. But the clue, the power, the leverage is in recognizing you have this set of feelings and it's something in your personality development that has nothing to do with the market decision. But as you get conscious of where the source of those feelings, then it's a lot easier to pull that spaghetti bowl apart. It doesn't solve the feelings, the self-image feelings necessarily at first, but it does start to detach them from the market decision.
I want to dig into a lot of different perspectives that you can offer the audience, but I think it would be fun to go back in time a little bit. I'm looking at a title of your thesis research, the neurobiology of Freud's repetition compulsion. So I think it would be interesting for the audience, as you're offering these great insights, to give them a perspective as to how you developed. Because you had to go down a path to get to the point where you can help people. Even before, I'm going to let you explain that thesis title, and perhaps to us mere mortals, bring us into where your work went with that thesis research. But perhaps even before that, what was the trigger for you as a young person that you went down this path? Was there any one aha moment, a mentor, something where you said, my gosh, the study of the mind, the human condition, behavior, this is where I'm going. I can't be stopped.
First, I got to say, wow, I'm impressed, because I've been interviewed, scores of times, and no one's ever asked me about that paper or how that came to be.
I try. I'm 500 episodes in. I'm working at this,
Yeah. No, I'm seriously impressed and happy, actually. Now, of course, in my mind, I'm sort of like, well, where do I start? Because sometimes,
exactly.
Honestly, Michael, I feel like my whole life, and I mean my whole life, has contributed to me being in this position where I seem to have figured out this thing related to feelings and emotions and performance.
What's the first age where you knew you were observing the human condition in such a way that you felt different, or you felt like inside you felt like you had something? I mean, were you really, really young? When did that, is there any kind of like early memory where that starts for you?
There's performance evidence that it started way before I knew it. I was an only child. I was also adopted at 4 months old. I was unusually mature. Like my teachers would always say, I seemed older than I was. And I could always win these contests at like amusement parks. I grew up in Ohio, and at Cedar Park, I could always get, the guys to say I was 14 when I was 12, or 12 when I was 10, or whatever. It was usually 3 years. They usually thought I was 3 years older. Then I worked at a summer camp, honestly, and I was 16. They put me in a senior counselor position, and you were supposed to be in college. And then they brought the children's home kids out for a week. And they brought me into the office, and they said, okay, this is going to be kind of weird, but we want to give you the senior high school girls. And some of them are older than you. I was like, what? So I was very honest. I'm still kind of honest to a fault. And this was a Christian camp. So, we were definitely like ethics was a big deal. But I basically made the decision that I was going to lie and say I was 19, because I wasn't telling these girls I grew up in a children's home that they were 2 years older than me. But we had a fabulously successful week. And it's just a point where I seem to have some understanding of human nature that honestly I think came from partially growing up as an only child with a mother who, fair to say, was somewhat self-absorbed. So I had a lot of time to sort of think. I didn't have 5 brothers and sisters. Like everyone else in my neighborhood was Catholic, these big families. And so there was and I was an early riser. Like I just had lots of time to be introspective. And I somehow think that led me to the position where people considered me more mature, or, I get children's home girls that are 2 and 3 years older than me in my cabin. But when I first really recognized that there was something to be studied and something to be figured out, was like my mid to late 20s. I started noticing that all of my friends would get in these relationships, and some were marriages, and these relationships would break up. And then they would get in another relationship, and the people involved would be completely different, but the scenarios would be exactly the same. And I was like, that's bizarre. That's just bizarre. And I actually, at the time, worked for IBM. IBM had a great benefits program. And so I thought, you know what? I'm going to go to therapy, like as a lark, and see what I can learn. Like, IBM will pay for it. What the heck? And I go to this woman. It was in Cleveland, Ohio at the time. Her name was Joan Rich. And like I was dating this guy. And one day she says to me, well, how do you think he feels about you? And I say, well, blah, 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 blah. And she's like, well, it might have gone the other way around. I never remember which way these questions went. But then she's like, well, how do you think your father really feels about you? And I started to say, blah, blah. And I realized the identical words were about to come out of my mouth. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. There's this there's a phenomenon where you think your romantic partner is the same as your parent, and like the light bulb went on. Lo and behold, I found out that Freud had identified this in 1889 or some year to that effect. I don't know the exact year, and called it the repetition compulsion. And he has this beautiful paragraph that describes how people get in similar situations while they look completely different. And he's actually referring mainly to work situations in this paragraph. But in the end, they always end the exact same way for the exact same reasons. So I was like, that seems to be true. And I was a biology undergraduate. I'd always been really interested in what makes us tick. And again, I'll go back to that, like, lots of alone introspective time as an only child. So I was like, well, if we do that, if we unconsciously get ourselves in similar situations or recreate a situation, contribute to a situation such that it recreates a feeling, then there's got to be a template in our brain. I was actually supposed to go to Stanford Business School while I was still at IBM. I thought to myself, I don't know if I want to be doing the MBA, computer, rising the corporate ladder thing. I think I'm going to leave IBM, and this was back when it was still a great job and no one ever left IBM, and go to graduate school in psychology. And I found out that University of Chicago had this basically design your own master's program where you don't have to take 2, research level classes and then get a professor to sponsor you for research. So that's what I did. And there you have. It really should be the neurobiology of Freud's theory of the repetition compulsion. But no one ever pointed that out or realized that until just a few years ago.
What was you just mentioned one of the kind of the with your partner and kind of mimicking or perhaps connecting with parents, but what was some of the other research that came through that? What was some of the other insights that because that started to lay the foundation for where you've come up to today? Yeah,
totally. So I'm not sure if you're referring to the master's thesis or to the actual experiences of repetition.
The thesis, yeah.
At that point, it was called biopsychology. And I really had to do, what my advisor ended up calling like the best literature review she'd ever seen. I literally went to the library and tried to find articles on child development related to emotions and I was really trying to look for the unconscious because we're not conscious. We're getting ourselves in the same situation or marrying the same person again or, having the same argument with our boss. We're not conscious that we're creating this. So, but there was very, very little written. So I had to, and there's still, honestly, that paper, for what it's worth, I was sitting at a conference in New York a couple of years ago, a Saturday conference, and the society, what's it called? The president of the Neuropsychoanalytic Society was giving the keynote. And she said, let me give you a history of neuropsychoanalysis. And she says, one of the first 2 or 3 papers ever written in this field, and she has my paper on the list. Michael, I almost fell off the chair. It was first of all, I didn't know anyone knew about this paper, and I certainly wasn't expecting anyone to. So there were most people have heard of attachment theory, which is, how an infant ends up attaching to its caregiver, and they've been qualified as these different styles of organized attachment and disorganized attachment. But I was like, okay, there's something going on there when a baby is born and how they're starting to recognize that they're separate from their mother or the person taking care of them. There's also a phenomenon called critical periods. And so it's most easily seen in birds or understood in birds. There's lots of birds, if they don't hear their characteristic song during a specific point when they're babies, they'll never be able to sing it. I'm not sure sing is the right word for birds. And so I was like, wow, I think there's a critical period for attachment and self-image as you ultimately unconsciously, assume what your relationship is to other important figures. Basically, then I started to walk through the biology of child development as to how that could get set up so that, years later, any one of us is acting and reacting in relationship to important figures, whether that's spouses or bosses or the police or the market, because that's what I figured out way later. And we're reacting out of this template that was built in the first 2-3 years of our existence.
That's a tough insight, though, because if people, don't have a great first 2 to 3 years, but, they continue on, they grow, they get older, and then you have a population as a whole, and some of that population had a great 2 to 3 years, some of it didn't. But then as adults, we're all there standing in the pit together, so to speak, debating, arguing, trying to move forward. And it can be very difficult if some folks have had that great early start versus some folks not having it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it isn't to say that people they can't mitigate if they had a bad first, early life, that they can't mitigate it. It also isn't to say, people develop coping mechanisms or sometimes defense mechanisms that oftentimes serve them. So, for example, a common one with children is if things are really difficult and the child then feels, of course, powerless because the child is powerless. One coping mechanism that people develop is blaming themselves because actually, if you think about it, if you blame yourself for something, it actually gives you the feeling that you might have some control over it. Blaming yourself, though, can ultimately at least superficially and practically to an extent, be helpful because it can make you work harder, try harder, make you more responsible. What I'm saying is the way people react to maybe suboptimal attachment and self-image doesn't necessarily turn out to be negative. Now, having said that, though, at the worst moment, when provoked or when challenged, extensively by the market, you might see some sort of patterned reaction that could be untangled if you could connect it to the person's feelings about who they are and what their place in the world is and how they relate to people or situations of authority.
Let me bring you to the markets. How did you enter? What was you're going down this one path, and it doesn't sound like, you can correct me if I'm wrong, it doesn't sound like you were going down the markets and money path and billions,
No.
So what was the trigger? What was the crossover for you?
Well, I was in Chicago, going to the University of Chicago and working out at East Bank Club in Chicago, and I played beach volleyball with a group of people, and a couple of them were floor traders at the SIBO.
Hold on. I hope people are making notes right now that if you want to end up at some point in time for the next Wall Street series that will appear on a cable channel, you start at the beach volleyball right? I mean, this is life. Life is great, huh? Continue. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah. So one of my friends in that volleyball group said to me at one point, he'd said to me, I think, I was fascinated by his trading. For one thing, I was fascinated by his trading. And I would ask him questions about you go down there in the morning, and you make $10,000 and you come home at 2:00. How does this work? And he had sort of teased me, well, you should come down there. And I'm like, not a chance. And then the SIBA or Board of Trade introduced a weather futures seat. And he tried really hard to get me to buy I say weather futures seat because I was like, what the heck is that? This makes no sense to me. Now, probably related is my father was a very consistent investor. He literally never sold a share of stock, but he consistently bought stock and tracked the market, as did my grandmother, even though she had been single. She divorced her husband in 1932 in the middle of the Depression with 2 young kids. But anyway, so I had this kind of point being I had a family that paid attention to the market. So there was some sort of sometimes I feel like I ended up in the family business, even though we didn't really have one. But anyway, so Mr. Weather Futures seat, when I was finally writing my master's thesis, he was approached in the summer of 1994 to go upstairs in one of the first upstairs trading firms, meaning trading on screen. But of course, you didn't get intraday P&L. And he and his buddy, who were going to one of these first prop firms, so to speak, said, okay, we'll make you a deal. If you come, while you're just writing that silly master's thesis of yours and thinking about whether you're going to get your PhD, or not. How about you come keep track of our P&L intraday, and we'll teach you to trade. And I was like, oh, all right, this sounds interesting. And sure enough, within a few months, I had actually joined the firm as myself and stopped keeping track of their P&L intraday, and learned to trade from someone named Bob Cantor, who had actually come to Chicago from New York to start this prop firm. Then I went to Schoenfeld for a little bit to learn momentum trading. And my PhD obviously went by the wayside. And I just started reading, Mark Douglas, Brett Steenbarger, Alexander Elder, all the trading psychology out there. And Market Wizards, I can remember going home on Friday night and saying, I don't need to go out and party with you guys. I'd just rather go home and read this book and have a glass of wine on my couch. So I was totally fascinated by the psychology side of it. In that first prop firm, we had all sorts of different styles, from really short-term momentum to scalping utilities to relatively long-term illiquid stocks. And I was trying to figure out what is this? And how are you successful in this? And how do these guys take these different approaches? And truthfully, I didn't understand it. And it seemed like that interesting, fun master's thesis was just this expensive diversion that I had, and it was never going to be anything more than this expensive diversion that I had.
I don't say it as a sad note, because I had pleasant conversations with him, but I tried for years to have Mark Douglas on this show, and he finally had finished his newest work and had committed, and then unfortunately passed away. I was so disappointed. He was so particular in the sense that he didn't want to come out before he was ready, and I kept trying, but
I sat down with him in 2005. I actually hired him when I was trading. And I later actually hired Ari Keefe too, when I came to New York to run a trading desk. But I got back in touch with Mark when people started to ask me to coach after my first few articles and my first few talks. And frankly, then I was studying in a psychoanalytic institute in the evening when people first started asking me to coach based on these articles. But in any event, I sat down. I had the opportunity to see Mark in Las Vegas and sat down with him, and to hear him talk about the blood, sweat, and tears that he put into those books. I mean, he and I, if he were alive today, we wouldn't agree on everything, but I had such respect for him because it meant so much to him to get it right. And I feel like part of the difference is that I just had the advantage of having more neuroscience. Maybe I had the advantage of being able to have insight that wasn't available when he was first writing.
Let me tear that apart a little, because we've talked a few names here, and you've drawn some lines, and you mentioned Anthony Robbins earlier. I would share an experience that I had right around 1994. I had picked up Anthony Robbins' Unlimited Power. I did not read the whole thing, I don't think, but I read the part about Steven Spielberg going to the Universal lot, and that motivated me to ultimately, around that time period, 1994, to literally go knock on the doors of the Market Wizards that we were just talking about for that particular book. And it was that he kind of gave me permission that was okay. So I know Anthony Robbins does quite a few things, but for me, that one little particular piece of insight, to go find the best and try and model the best was very clever advice. I don't really know a lot of people that do that I talk to. I still think it's great advice for me in particular.
Yeah. I think it's great advice too. It seems like it's sort of funny that it is not more obvious to people.
Exactly. We grow up with the idea of, frankly, go to school, memorize a bunch of stuff, get a job, die.
Right. Exactly. We did. Crazy.
Let me pick though a little bit more in the sense that I won't name any names because a lot of folks have appeared on my show. But if you want to kind of draw some differences for people to think about in a kind of an intellectual way, you're welcome to. But there are quite a few people that have kind of, for lack of a better term, let's just say trading psychology or trading coach. There's quite a few people that members of my audience will recognize, and other names, including your name, of course. But talk about perhaps comparing yourself and contrasting, and perhaps you just mentioned Mark Douglas, where you see yourself that you have gone in a different way, or perhaps you might think it's the better way.
Well, I do. That's fair. Truthfully, I think, first of all, you've got to step back and recognize the mental problem of markets, which is relentless uncertainty. And, no one knows what's going to happen this afternoon. And that's a specific type of problem to the brain, where it particularly draws on context to try to fill in the pieces of what's the right decision to make. And specifically drawing on context, it definitely draws on the person's feelings, even though an analytical, logically trained person might not realize it. I bring this neuroscience that shows, for example, you have to have emotion to make a decision. And that master's thesis, by the way, was republished in 2003 in a psychoanalytic journal. And I updated it because it had been originally written in 94, 95. And that's when researchers had shown you had to have emotion to make a decision. And I was like, well, darn, so much of this trading psychology is wrong because you can't, if you took the emotion out of it completely, you wouldn't be able to make a decision. In the subsequent 12 or 13 years, the role of what an academic will call affect, which is like the difference between before or after you've had coffee or before or after you've had a cocktail, sort of mood, optimism, and emotion, which is a specific intense form of that, which also includes conviction, by the way. I've had this conversation with many people in the trading hedge fund space, and I feel perfectly justified in saying conviction is an emotion because it's an intense physical experience. My work focuses on that dimension and on making it respectable, making it data, understanding it, pulling apart as the most important job. Now, having said that, you have to have, I couldn't take somebody and make them, aware of all of their feelings and emotions and not have the training to be a trader or portfolio manager. I'm not saying it's the most important job without having, courses 101 through 401. But it's the key when you want to seriously improve your performance or fix what is otherwise an unsolvable problem.
Let me get you to pause for 1 second and let the audience come into your world. Conviction as data. I agree. Without having your training, there's a different, when you have that conviction deep in your core, there is an entirely different feeling. I mean, from the biology to the brain, everything is just in alignment. It's like, wow, go time. But talk about conviction as data and how that would be better understood for the audience.
Well, so for example, like an exercise we just did with a hedge fund that we're working with is we got them to do a 7-point scale as to levels of confidence, which I think is slightly different than conviction, but for all practical purposes, we can use them for the same as this. Like there's, varying levels of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, let's just say. For them to be able to decide jointly among the analysts and PMs on a scale they're going to use to describe their varying levels of fear, uncertainty, and doubt on the road to confidence and conviction, develop a language around the words of doubt or concern or panic or anxiety, and start to fold the question and the usage of those words into their analysis and into their conversations. So like one of the analysts ended up saying, he said, every time we do risk reward, we have to also say where we are on our 7-point confidence spectrum, because it's like the sum total of everything. And we need to track how it changes, because basically, let's say you're confident and then you become somewhat concerned. First of all, you need to recognize that your state has changed, because somewhere your unconscious pattern recognition is telling you there's something that needs looked at or analyzed. And if you then are explicit about it, and you can say to your colleagues, I'm moving from concerned to nervous, then you can help each other ask questions about, okay, what piece of data or what event did change where you are in that spectrum, and what do we need to do to either resolve it or to dig deeper into it in order to resolve it. Or if we dig deeper into it, what does it say about being in the position or position sizing?
Could I think of it this way? A volatility measure like ATR, okay, there's a number. Conviction as a number, instead of letting conviction be a feeling that's bouncing around in the 6 inches between our ears, you want to get it out of just that internal process and get it to something where we can kind of look at it and measure it.
Absolutely. That's exactly it.
Well, then I'm a good student today.
or I'm so deep in the weeds that I forget to make it accessible.
Well, no, I think it's just.
I mean, not that you're not a good student.
No, I just, just trying to bring it out and say it in a different way and make sure everyone's following along. I mean, I kind of get instinctively where you're going. It is kind of, for me, even it's an aha moment of like, okay, wow, everyone listening, whether they're trading or not, could start to think of, and of course they can go follow your work and read your book, look at your research papers, but the idea of taking what's inside, the feelings inside, and taking more control of them, and I mean, not control to try and make them go away, but to at least to analyze them in terms of where are they on the spectrum? Are they cold or are they hot?
To use them. I mean, okay, technically in science you can't prove anything, but like we're pretty sure the sun rises in the east. The point being, like, I'm really sure that from a brain perception judgment point of view, what you feel, and that can be just as simple as, can you feel your heart rate, to you feel extreme anxiety or frustration or conviction, and wherever you are on that continuum, there is information in there. Basically, none of us have been taught to think about it that way, and we certainly haven't been taught to look at it and analyze it in any way. And I can tell you, those people who do, there's alpha in it, there's market performance in it. There are fewer bad decisions because you end up being able to mitigate working out your personality in the market. And that actually opens you up also to better intuitive feelings. And that reminds me of something I wanted to say. A moment ago, you said something like, you got this instinctively. I can tell you and I would not be sitting here if it weren't for 2003, 4, 5, 6, when I first started being invited to write or speak about it. And, lots of people in the audience saying, oh my gosh, I finally make sense to myself. I thought it was just me. Like, I didn't want to tell anybody that I was that my feelings and emotions either got in my way or they helped me in some way. And I didn't understand why, all the conventional sort of cognitive behavioral stuff, I thought it was my failing. But what you said makes so much sense to me. So I feel like I only ended up here because I was in this crazy situation where I had an interest in some information. And maybe, even being an only child who was adopted, I didn't have such a strong family culture that I was able to be a little bit more iconoclastic and a little bit more of a rebel. So that I could say, hey, wait a minute, guys, the emperor has no clothes. This view on emotion is wrong from a brain point of view and from a practical point of view. And when I talk about it, so many people say, yeah, it resonates and it makes sense to them.
I have one big topic area, which is kind of somewhat in the same topic area where we've been going. But I want to introduce a character that some people will know and some people will not know. But I think you can kind of tell a little bit of his story, and that would be Benoit Mandelbrot and the idea of fractal emotions. You might first want to put your professorial hat on and explain fractals, but then also fractal emotions.
When I first started coaching, I didn't realize that my, psychoanalytic repetition compulsion background was going to come into direct play. But I would say, I had my first clients in 2003. By sometime 2006, I can remember one client. It was so obvious that they were repeating their life story in the problems they had in the market. Which, by the way, the guy he was trading on the floor, CVOT, made a bunch of money every morning. Forgive me, the other way around. Lost a bunch of money every morning, but would always make it back. And was making good money, but basically called me up and said, if I didn't start out the day down like 25 grand, in the pit, he goes, I wouldn't have to I'd be making twice as much money. Why is this? And it turns out he was born to a mother on welfare. He had this sort of rags to riches story, and we kind of figured out he was just repeating his whole life in everyday's trading. And once we unraveled that, he stopped doing that. But fractal emotions. So by the time it came to write my book, and I was trying to think more and more deeply about this and how to describe it, I had come across the concept of fractal, which is patterns repeated on different scales. And the easiest way for people to think about that are stalks of broccoli or tree branches, where, one little small piece of broccoli really looks the same as the whole head of broccoli. It's just a different size. And one little set of tree branches kind of looks the same as the whole tree, just a different size, or to use the technical term, scale. I studied fractals from a market price, repetition point of view. And I learned that Mandelbrot was basically the founder of, or the person who originally recognized them. I mean, there's some argument about that. But, basically Mandelbrot. And it just hit me. I was reading some of Mandelbrot's work when I was writing my book, and I was like, wait a minute. That's what these repetitive emotions are. It's the same. You have this little pattern like you have in the little tiny piece of broccoli, and it gets, reapplied at a different scale in a different situation, but the core pattern is there. I honestly believe that what Freud called the compulsion to repeat, what I will tend to call repetitive emotions, that they are fractal, just in the same way broccoli is or a tree is. Now, I think in a human being, it's an opportunity to optimize. Like part of it happens because you learned it, but it also gives you an opportunity. The discomfort of it gives you an opportunity to say, okay, what do I want to untangle about this pattern?
I find Mandelbrot a fascinating guy, and I'm kind of late to the party on him too. And in fact, I would be curious your view. For example, when it comes to markets and money, he was one of the first to be saying, this efficient market hypothesis might have some holes in it.
Yeah.
What your perspective there on his perspective?
Well, clearly the efficient market has some holes in it.
But you say clearly, hold on. There's a lot of people at the University of Chicago that might say, hold on, Denise, we don't think so.
But there's a lot of people at the University of Chicago who would also agree with me. That's a big thing at the University of Chicago. The efficient markets crowd versus the behavioral finance crowd.
Yes, with Dick Thaler and whatnot.
Yeah. And if you're in the business school, you're sort of, whose camp are you in?
For me, I look at it and I say, hold on. The efficient market hypothesis theory, when they attempt to explain October of 2008, it just falls down.
I think it falls down a lot of the time. It's helpful. If you're going to research something, you have to put some stake in the ground and have some cornerstone to work with, which in a lot of ways is what the efficient markets hypothesis is. But then at the end of the day, you got to say, okay, my research sprung from this foundation, but this foundation also cast these questions as to the results, and that has to be reconciled. And in a way, Harry Markowitz of, what's his paper?
The one that won the Nobel Prize.
The one won the Nobel Prize. Yeah.
I don't remember the name exactly either.
Yeah.
And I'm friends with Harry.
Yeah. Well, you could ask him, but he will tell you, and it's very clear to see. And I have this in a lot of my presentations. It might even be in my book. The very first paragraph of his paper says, figuring out what you believe is step one. Then figuring out how to apply it is step two. Allocating assets based on what you believe is step one. Or step two. Confused myself. The net of it is, Markowitz says that you have to figure out what you believe is step one. And the paper does not cover step one. He says this paper starts at step two, and I'm not qualified to speak about step one. And then at the end of the paper, he says 3 or 4 times, remember to go back and try to understand step one. This paper's focused on step two.
I don't think he really likes the idea that his work was, and I'm paraphrasing a little here, his work was taken into a certain direction, which is essentially now, people out on Wall Street will say, well, Harry Markowitz work, this is the foundation of everyone should be in a passive index and nothing more.
Right.
I don't think he concurs there at all.
Yeah, I can totally believe that. Yeah.
Yeah. I have to tell you something funny. When I interviewed him for my film years back, and then a documentary film, and then I had him on the podcast a few years ago too, and it was so great. I don't know how old he is today. I should Google it, but he's over 90, I believe.
Yeah,
but it's so fabulous. I call him up on the phone, and he answers the phone. It's like, and you can hear this in the podcast. It's like, hello, this is Harry Markowitz. You're just right. He sounds like he's 16.
Yeah. Oh, really? Oh, that's great. I'm so glad to hear that.
I mean, things will change. Of course, it changes for us all. But I don't think I've ever heard someone that pepper over the age of 90. So fabulous.
I love that. That's inspiration.
Yeah. Hey, so Denise, let me. I can't keep you, but I do want people to check out your work. Market Mind Games: A Radical Psychology of Investing, Trading, and Risk. It has been out for a few years, but people should check that out. Where else can we send people to check in on you and your world?
Well, I haven't had any time to update my blog in months now, but I do have a blog on the rethinkgroup.net. I do have a newsletter that I also haven't had any time to write. Last one I wrote was during the World Series last year, but I'm committed to fixing that over the summer.
Basically, if people want you, they have to really want you, and they have to come find you somehow or another, and then they might get a hold of you. Something like that?
Well, we do try to answer all the contact us requests that we get. I did literally just yesterday hire an assistant. Hopefully it will get better. We have, we've also taken on some athletes. We're working with the U.S. Olympic border cross team, which is snowboard racing. That's contributed to the backlog is on our to-do list. And that's a whole different conversation, how trading psychology, sports psychology does not apply to trading psychology in many ways. Basically, the short version of that is that you can make something happen in sports, and in the market, you have to sit back and interact with it more like sailing or surfing. And that creates two totally different mental problems and two totally different set of feelings that you need to understand.
I watched the last, 7 or 8 years of Tiger Woods. Clearly, he's been dealing with all kinds of injuries and all kinds of surgeries. But it does also look like there's a performance coach need there. And this is me on the sidelines critiquing perhaps one of the best golfers ever. But it is quite interesting to watch somebody who is at such a high level then just literally fall off the cliff. And, again, there's injuries involved there. He's had multiple surgeries, but you have to think that the mind part, for him to be so locked in for so long and then to kind of not be locked in, it's pretty crazy to watch as an outsider.
In 2011, I had the opportunity to golf in a event where the LPGA was with us, and so we had fivesomes, and every group had an LPGA player in it. And a woman told me about the performance coach she had hired, which was the same one Tiger Woods had hired. She described it as very cognitive and very thought-based. And frankly, I thought, I don't know if this is going to work.
Yeah, the feelings are all wrapped up, but it's great to go the thought direction, but you got to get the feelings direction going the right way too, huh?
Well, he had that. He used to show his frustration, and that actually helped him. And then he got a lot more decorum when he came back from. And I would submit that did not help him.
Yeah, well, you know what? We'll circle back here in the time to come, and maybe go the sports direction as your firm branches out. I think it's really interesting stuff too. Denise, is there a particular website, a URL where we can send people?
Yes, it's the Rethink Group, and it's .net.
Denise, I appreciate it. I did not expect to be on this podcast. As I watched Billions last year, I did not expect to be talking with someone who had a role in the show coming on air. So that's really cool stuff.
It was at the beginning, but
well, still, I mean, the one character clearly, influenced by you. So, and to hear your friends and associates say, "There's Denise on screen," that's kind of cool, fun stuff.
Thank you so much.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash, or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.